The photograph arrived at my desk on a Monday morning, delivered by courier from the archives of Pemberton College, a small liberal arts institution in Massachusetts that had closed its doors in 1967. The college's records were being digitized before being transferred to the State Historical Society, and the archivist had flagged this particular image as anomalous and wanted a specialist's opinion. I'm a photographic historian who specializes in authentication and analysis of early 20th century images, so I was used to examining unusual photographs. But when I opened the archival sleeve and looked at this image, I felt a cold sensation crawl up my spine. The photograph showed what appeared to be a college classroom or lecture hall, probably from around 1904, based on the clothing styles and photographic techniques. Approximately 40 men sat in tiered rows of wooden seats with fold-out desks, all wearing dark suits typical of the era. Most held papers or books. A few men stood at the back of the room. Two large windows let in bright light from the left side of the frame. It looked like a completely ordinary class photograph, until you looked closely at one particular student. In the third row, slightly left of center, sat a young man in a dark suit. His posture was normal, his hands folded on the desk in front of him, like the other students. But where his head should have been, there was nothing. Not a blur, not a shadow, not an empty space. His collar simply ended, and above it was the wall behind him, visible as though his head had never existed. The effect was so seamless that I initially thought it must be a deliberate photographic manipulation, perhaps created as a joke or a technical demonstration. But as I examined the image under magnification, I found no evidence of tampering. The emulsion was continuous across the area where the head should have been. There was no double exposure, no cutting and pasting, no retouching. This appeared to be a single, unmanipulated exposure, showing a room full of students, one of whom had somehow been photographed without a head. I called the archivist at Pemberton College. Her name was Dr. Sarah Brennan, and she'd been cataloguing the college's photographic collection for the past 2 years. "I was hoping you'd call," she said, when I identified myself. "That photograph has been keeping me up at night. Have you figured out what's wrong with it?" "I can confirm it's not a manipulated image," I said, "but I can't explain the anomaly." "Do you have any provenance information?" "Some. The photograph is labeled Philosophy 301, Professor Whitmore, Spring 1904. I found a course catalogue from that year, listing Professor Edmund Whitmore as teaching an advanced philosophy seminar. There's also a class roster with 38 names, though I count more than that in the photograph. 38 students, but more than that appear in the image. Yes, 42 by my count, and that's including the one without a head. I looked at the photograph again, counting carefully. She was right. 42 men visible, though the official roster listed only 38. "Is there any notation on the photograph itself?" I asked. "Anything written on the back or on the mounting?" "Nothing on the front, but on the back, someone wrote in pencil, Spring 1904. Remember him. Remember him. Just those 2 words." "Dr. Brennan, do you have access to student records from 1904? Death records, disciplinary files, anything unusual?" "I've been looking. There's a gap in the records. Several folders from spring 1904 are missing. But I did find one thing." She paused. "A memorial notice in the college newspaper from May 1904. It says that Thomas Aldrich, a senior in the class of 1904, died suddenly on March 28th. cause of death was listed as accidental. His funeral was held on campus, and the entire senior class attended. Thomas Aldridge, I repeated, writing it down.
Was he in Professor Whitmore's philosophy class?
I don't know. Like I said, several record folders are missing. But there's something else. The memorial notice includes a quote from Professor Whitmore. He said, "Thomas was a brilliant student whose loss is felt by all who knew him. He engaged with the great questions of existence with a fearless mind. It is a tragedy that he will not be here to graduate with his classmates." A fearless mind. Great questions of existence. The language stood out. Formal, even for 1904. "Do you have any other photographs from that time period showing Thomas Aldridge?" I asked. "I've been searching, but I haven't found any yet. It's possible he appears in the 1904 yearbook, but that volume is missing from our collection." After the call, I continued examining the photograph. The headless student sat in a natural posture, his body present and solid, his hands visible and properly positioned. The desk in front of him showed papers like the other students' desks. The men sitting beside him showed no reaction to his condition. They sat normally, looking toward the camera, as though nothing was wrong. I enhanced different sections of the image digitally, examining the area where the student's head should have been. The background wall was perfectly visible, showing the same texture and grain as the wall visible in other parts of the photograph. There was no ghosting, no faint outline, no suggestion that a head had once been there and had somehow been erased. It was as if the student had never had a head, as if he'd sat for this photograph as a headless body, and no one had noticed or cared. I found more information about Thomas Aldridge through genealogical databases and newspaper archives. He'd been born in 1882 in Worcester, Massachusetts. He'd attended Pemberton College on a scholarship, studying philosophy and classics. He'd been regarded as one of the brightest students in his class. And he'd died on March 28, 1904, at age 21. The Worcester Telegram ran a brief article. "College student dies in tragic accident." Thomas Aldridge, a senior at Pemberton College, died yesterday evening in what authorities are calling a tragic accident. According to college officials, Aldridge was found in the chemistry laboratory with severe injuries. Dr. Edmund Whitmore, Aldridge's philosophy professor, discovered the body and summoned help, but Aldridge was pronounced dead at the scene. The nature of the injuries and the circumstances of the accident have not been disclosed. Aldridge was known as an exceptional student with a promising future. He is survived by his parents and 2 sisters. Severe injuries. Nature not disclosed. Found in the chemistry laboratory. I searched for more details, but found none. The incident seemed to have been quietly buried, with no investigation reported and no further newspaper coverage. I went back to the photograph and examined it with new eyes. If this was Thomas Aldridge, the headless student in the 3rd row, then this photograph had been taken sometime in the spring semester of 1904, before his death on March 28th. Unless it had been taken after. I called Dr. Brennan again. "Do you have any records indicating exactly when this photograph was taken?" "Nothing definitive, but I found something interesting. The college photographer's ledger shows he was paid for classroom portraits on April 15, 1904. That's 2.5 weeks after Thomas Aldridge died.
My mouth went dry. The photograph was taken after Aldridge was dead. It appears so. And there's something else. I found Professor Whitmore's diary in a box of personal papers that were donated to the college after his death. He kept detailed daily entries. On April 15, 1904, he wrote, "Had the class photographed today. All present as promised. Even Thomas kept his word, though it cost him dearly." The students suspect nothing. They see only what they expect to see. What does that mean?
Even Thomas kept his word. He was dead. I know. But Whitmore wrote it as though Aldridge had been there. As though he'd participated in the photograph. She paused. There's more. Earlier entries from March describe Whitmore's philosophy seminar as exploring the boundaries between material and immaterial existence. He wrote that Aldridge had become obsessed with the question of whether consciousness could persist after the death of the body. I felt cold. What happened to Professor Whitmore? He continued teaching until 1910, then resigned suddenly. He moved to New York and died in 1923. But I found one more thing in his papers. A letter he wrote to a colleague in 1909, discussing his time at Pemberton. He mentioned the spring 1904 seminar and wrote, "I believed then that we were engaged in pure philosophical inquiry. I did not realize until too late that Thomas had taken our discussions as instructions rather than theory. What he did was not my fault, but I will carry the guilt until I die." "What did Thomas Aldridge do?" I asked quietly. "I don't know, but I think it had something to do with how he died. Severe injuries in the chemistry laboratory. And Whitmore's comment that Thomas kept his word, though it cost him dearly." I spent the next week researching everything I could find about Pemberton College in spring 1904. I discovered that Professor Whitmore's advanced philosophy seminar had been focused on questions of consciousness, identity, and the relationship between mind and body. Whitmore had been influenced by spiritualism and early psychical research, and he'd apparently encouraged his students to explore these topics experimentally. I found a student diary from one of Aldridge's classmates, preserved in a family collection and later digitized. The entries from March 1904 were illuminating. March 10. Thomas has become quite fervent about his research project. He says he's discovered a way to prove that consciousness is independent of the physical body. Professor Whitmore encourages his efforts, though some of us think Thomas is taking things too seriously. March 20. Thomas showed us his preparations. He's convinced that if he can separate consciousness from bodily form, he can prove the mind's primacy. He says he'll demonstrate it for us after the spring holiday. March 29. Terrible news. Thomas is dead. They say it was an accident in the chemistry laboratory, but I know what he was attempting. He told me the day before. He said he would prove his theory by transcending physical limitation. I fear he succeeded in a way none of us anticipated. Thomas Aldridge had attempted to prove philosophical theories through self-experimentation. He'd tried to demonstrate that consciousness could exist independently of the body. And somehow, he'd succeeded. Or at least, he'd convinced himself he would succeed. The nature of his injuries, never disclosed publicly, now made terrible sense. If he'd been found in the chemistry laboratory with severe injuries, if he'd been attempting to separate consciousness from physical form, I didn't want to think about what he might have done to himself. But the photograph told its own story. Taken 2.5 weeks after Aldridge's death, it showed Professor Whitmore's philosophy class. 38 living students, as listed on the roster, and 4 others, including one with no head, sitting calmly in the 3rd row, present for the photograph as promised. Thomas had kept his word. He'd been there for the class photograph, even after death. But something had gone wrong. The photograph had captured his presence, but not completely. His body appeared solid and real, but his head, the seat of consciousness, the location of the brain and mind he'd been so focused on, was absent, invisible, gone. Had he succeeded in separating his consciousness from his physical form? Had he transcended bodily limitation? Or had he simply destroyed himself in a philosophical experiment gone horribly wrong? Professor Whitmore had written that the students suspect nothing. They see only what they expect to see. The living students sitting beside Aldridge's headless form hadn't noticed anything amiss. They'd sat for the photograph, assuming everyone present was alive and whole, and the camera had recorded the truth they couldn't perceive. I enhanced the photograph one more time, examining the faces of the students sitting nearest to the headless figure. Most looked normally at the camera, their expressions typical of formal photographs. But one student, sitting directly behind the headless form, had an expression that seemed different. His eyes were wide, his face pale, and he appeared to be looking not at the camera, but downward, at the figure in front of him, as though he could see something the others couldn't. I found his name in the class roster. Michael Brennan, age 22. After graduation, he'd briefly worked as a teacher, but he'd left that position after only 2 years. Medical records indicated he'd been treated for nervous exhaustion in 1906 and had spent time in a sanitarium. He'd died in 1915, never having married or established a career. The student who'd sat behind Thomas Aldridge's headless form had been destroyed by what he'd witnessed. The photograph now sits in the archives at the Massachusetts Historical Society, properly preserved and documented. The placard beside it reads, Philosophy 301, Professor Edmund Whitmore, Pemberton College, Spring 1904. Anomalous photographic image showing class portrait with unexplained visual irregularity. The cause of the irregularity remains undetermined, though it coincides with the death of a student, Thomas Aldridge, who died in March 1904 in what was described as a laboratory accident. The placard doesn't mention that the photograph was taken after Aldridge's death. It doesn't explain that he appears in the image as a headless figure. It doesn't discuss Professor Whitmore's philosophical experiments or Thomas Aldridge's attempt to prove theories about consciousness through self-destruction. But those of us who've studied the image know the truth. Thomas Aldridge died on March 28, 1904, attempting to demonstrate that consciousness could exist independently of physical form. 2.5 weeks later, he appeared in his philosophy class photograph, keeping his promise to Professor Whitmore and his classmates. But the photograph captured only part of him. His body appeared, solid and present, sitting at a desk like the living students around him. But his head, his consciousness, his mind, the part of himself he'd been trying to free from physical limitation, was gone. Invisible. Transcended. Or simply destroyed. The photograph doesn't lie. It shows what was there on April 15, 1904, when Professor Whitmore's philosophy class assembled for their portrait. 38 living students. And Thomas Aldridge, dead for more than 2 weeks. Present, as promised, but incomplete. A body without a head. A physical form without consciousness. Proof, perhaps, that he'd succeeded in his experiment. Or proof that he'd failed catastrophically, separating his mind from his body in a way that left him trapped between existence and non-existence, visible to the camera, but not fully present, unable to be whole again. The photograph captures that impossible moment, a class portrait that includes the dead, a student who kept his promise even after death, a young man who wanted so desperately to prove philosophical theories that he destroyed himself in the attempt. And now, more than a century later, he sits in that third row forever, headless, incomplete, present, but not whole. A warning about the dangers of taking ideas too far, about the cost of trying to transcend human limitation, about what happens when philosophical theory becomes deadly experiment. Thomas Aldridge sits in that classroom still, without his head, without his mind, present in body alone, exactly the opposite of what he'd tried to prove. The photograph shows it all. The truth that the living students couldn't see. The reality that Professor Whitmore had to live with for the rest of his guilt-haunted life. One student doesn't have a head. And now we know why. Because he tried to prove his consciousness could exist without it. And succeeded, perhaps. Or failed. Or both. The photograph remains. The mystery endures. And Thomas Aldridge sits headless in that college classroom, frozen in 1904, forever present, forever incomplete, forever proof that some questions should never be answered through experiment. Some boundaries should never be crossed. Some truths should remain theoretical. And some photographs show us more than we ever wanted to see.